7 minutes underwater. Medical science says the brain dies at 4. Doctors give up at 6. Nobody survives 7. But on a storm-torn bridge in Miami, a woman who was supposed to be invisible, a fugitive with a fake ID and a shattered past, refused to let another woman die. She didn't know the pregnant stranger she was saving. She didn't know the stranger's brother was the most feared mafia boss in Florida. She didn't know that one dive into black water would end her old life completely and build her a new one she never dared to dream of. This is a channel for stories that remind you what human beings are truly capable of: raw loyalty, fierce protection, and the kind of love that forms inside a mafia family when an outsider earns her place not by birth, but by blood and sacrifice. The truth this story holds: the bravest thing a broken person can do is choose someone else's survival over their own safety. That single choice can rewrite everything. If dark water and a silver bracelet engraved with one word just gave you chills, you belong here. Like, comment, share, and hit subscribe. We read every single word you leave for us.
The penthouse on the 42nd floor loomed over the Chicago skyline, a fortress hanging in the night. The floor-to-ceiling windows mirrored the city lights, which created a false sense of glamour and freedom. But for Brooke Sinclair, this apartment had never been a home. It was a beautiful cage. She sat on the bed's edge in the master bedroom, her hands clenched together, her gaze locked on the wall clock. 11:43 at night. Preston would be home soon. Official parties usually ended around this time, and she knew exactly what condition her husband would be in when he arrived. Drunk. Not stumbling drunk, but just drunk enough to peel away the mask of the respectable prosecutor and show the man underneath. 5 years before, Brooke had met Preston Hale at a downtown charity event. She was 23 then, a recent graduate with a physical therapy degree, still trying to figure out her life. Preston had shown up like a prince in a perfectly fitted three-piece suit. At 33 years old, he was the youngest federal prosecutor in the history of the Chicago office, with a smile that could melt glaciers. He promised he would protect her, that he would handle everything for her. She had been naive enough to think that was love. She did not realize that for Preston, protection was just another word for control. The sound of the private elevator jerked Brooke back to reality. She heard the heavy footsteps on the hardwood floor, the thud of a briefcase being dropped on the couch. Then the bedroom door flew open. Preston was standing there, his tie loose, his eyes bloodshot from whiskey. But it was not the alcohol that made the hair on Brooke's arms stand up. It was the stack of papers he was holding. Her bank statements. "What was your promise to me, Brooke?" Preston's voice was not loud. In fact, it was quieter than normal. That is what made it so frightening. He never raised his voice when he was truly furious. "You lied to me. $1,000. Every single month you sent it to that addict in California." Preston stepped closer. Each footstep was like a hammer pounding nails into a coffin. "Keith is my brother. He is trying to get sober. I was just trying to help." Brooke never got to finish her sentence. Preston's hand seized her wrist and twisted it until the agony sent her to her knees. He dragged her to the walk-in closet, threw her inside, and slammed the door. The electronic lock made a final, sharp click. "You will stay in here until I figure out what to do with you." 48 hours. Brooke remained in that windowless room for 48 hours. She had nothing but a bottle of water and a few protein bars that the housekeeper slid under the door. She did not cry. She had run out of tears years ago. Instead, she began to make a plan. On the third day, Preston left for a 2-day business trip to Washington. Before he left, he opened the door and stared at Brooke like someone looking at a broken toy. "When I return, we are going to have a very serious discussion about your future." The door shut. The helicopter on the roof roared to life, and then its sound faded away. Brooke waited for one more hour, just to be sure. Then she started to move. She cried out that her stomach was in agony, writhing on the floor until the housekeeper panicked and unlocked the door. The glass of water she offered the woman was already spiked with 2 sleeping pills. 15 minutes later, the housekeeper was sound asleep on the couch. Brooke did not lose a single second. She went straight to Preston's office, the one room she was never allowed to enter. Using a code she had secretly memorized a long time ago, she opened his desk drawer. Inside, she found a small black USB drive. She had no idea what was on it. She just knew that Preston protected it like his life depended on it, and anything that important to him could be her weapon. She hid the USB inside a book in her purse, grabbed the emergency cash she had stashed in a box of feminine products under the sink, and walked into the elevator. As the steel doors closed, Brooke saw her reflection in the mirror. She could hardly recognize the woman who looked back at her. Her face was pale and her eyes were empty, but deep inside them was something she thought she had lost forever. Determination. She did not know her destination. She only knew that she had to get as far away as she could before Preston found out she was gone. Brooke did not use an app to call a ride. She knew Preston could track anything connected to her name, from her bank cards to her phone calls. So instead, she walked 7 blocks through the chilly Chicago night until she spotted an old yellow taxi waiting outside a 3-star hotel. She paid in cash. No questions were asked, and no names were given. The Greyhound bus station on the city's outskirts was her first stop. There, she used small bills to buy a ticket to Indianapolis, then found a seat at the very back of the bus. She pulled the bill of her baseball cap down low to cover her face. Throughout the entire 4-hour trip, she never closed her eyes. Every time the bus slowed down to let more people on, her heart tightened in her chest, as if an invisible hand was trying to crush it. Preston would know she was gone by morning. He would be furious, and with the authority of a federal prosecutor, he could use the entire system to hunt her down. Indianapolis welcomed Brooke with a gray morning and a cold, light rain that seemed to stick to every surface. She found her way to a used car dealership on the edge of town, where old vehicles were lined up like tired animals waiting for a new owner. She saw an older Honda CR-V. Its silver paint was dull, but its engine sounded healthy. The lot's owner was an elderly Mexican man who did not ask any questions as Brooke carefully counted out the bills and put the cash on his desk. There was no paperwork and no registration, just the keys. And just like that, she was on the road. Brooke did not drive directly south. She figured that is what Preston would expect. Instead, she drove north into Minnesota, then looped down through Iowa and cut over through Missouri. Each state line she crossed added another layer of protection. Every mile put more distance between her and the nightmare named Preston Hale. But miles on a map could not make the fear go away. On the long, lonely highways, every police car that showed up in her rearview mirror made Brooke fight back a surge of panic. Any car that followed her for too long felt like Preston's ghost on her tail. She ate her meals at gas stations, slept in her car in the parking lots of empty Walmarts, and cleaned up in public bathrooms. She looked like she was homeless, and that was part of the plan. She arrived flawlessly. 2 days later, Brooke pulled off the highway near a small town in Tennessee, parking beside a sprawling junkyard. She navigated through mountains of wrecked cars until she found what she needed, an old sedan with its license plate still on. Changing the plates was a serious crime, and she knew it. But facing prison was a better option than ever going back to Preston. When she crossed into Mississippi, the thick, humid air of the South wrapped around her. She stopped at a rundown gas station with a lone payphone outside and stood there for 10 minutes, just trying to work up the nerve to pick up the receiver. She had memorized the number to the rehab center in California a long time ago. It rang 3 times before a voice she knew so well answered. "Is that you, sis?" Keith's voice sounded solid, not like the last time they had talked. He wasn't trembling anymore. The deep exhaustion of someone fighting a constant battle was finally gone. "Are you okay?" Brooke fought to keep her own voice from shaking. "I heard you're almost done with the program." "Just 2 more weeks," he said. "But sis, Where are you calling from? I don't recognize this number. Is Preston there? Brooke squeezed her eyes shut, wanting to pour out every detail of the years of misery, the locked room, and the frantic escape she was in the middle of. But she couldn't. Keith was finally getting better. He needed calm, not another crisis to carry. I'm going to be fine, Keith. I just really needed to hear your voice. But you need to promise me something. What is it? He asked. Don't come looking for me. And if Preston calls you, you don't know anything. You haven't heard from me. You have no idea where I am. Do you get it? A long silence hung in the air between them. When Keith spoke again, his voice was low and heavy with concern. What did he do to you? Brooke slammed the phone down before her tears had a chance to start. She leaned her forehead against the cool plastic of the phone, taking slow, deep breaths until the sharp pain in her chest began to fade. Then she got back in her car and drove. The third day brought her to Florida. The state line sign appeared just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange that quickly melted into a deep purple. Every station on the car radio was broadcasting warnings about a tropical storm brewing off the coast of Miami. They were telling everyone to stay inside and that coastal roads might get shut down. The smart thing would have been to stop, find a cheap motel, and wait it out. But the storm in her past was far scarier than the one on the horizon. She drove on, heading south, straight for Miami, straight into the storm. At 11:30 that night, the Palm Island Bridge appeared through the driving rain, a thin line of concrete floating over a black void. Deep canals churned with angry, violent waves on both sides. The wind howled, hitting the car in powerful blasts that shook it like a dead leaf. The rain wasn't falling down. It was flying sideways, hitting the windshield like a spray of tiny pebbles. Brooke gripped the steering wheel with both hands, her eyes straining to see more than 30 feet in front of her. This was a terrible idea. She knew it was a terrible idea, but turning back now was impossible. Suddenly, bright headlights cut through the darkness from behind her. Brooke glanced in the rearview mirror, and her heart began to hammer against her ribs. 3 black Escalades with tinted windows were closing in fast, driving in a tight, organized line like a security detail. The first one flashed its high beams. On instinct, Brooke moved into the right lane to let them pass. The 3 sport utility vehicles flew by her like massive, dark ghosts. For just a split second, as the middle vehicle passed, she saw a small figure in the back seat through the rain-streaked window. It was a young woman, and her hand was resting on the gentle slope of her stomach. She was pregnant. The convoy disappeared into the storm up ahead. Brooke kept driving over the bridge, fighting to keep the car from swerving with each brutal gust of wind. She had no idea who those people were, and she did not want to know. Her only goal was to get to the other side of this bridge, find a safe place to hide, and make it through the night. But the universe had a different plan. About 200 meters ahead, the 3 Escalades suddenly hit their brakes. Their red tail lights blared through the rain like the eyes of some terrible beast. At the same exact moment, a truck came barreling toward them from the opposite direction. It had no headlights on. It did not honk its horn. It was just a huge slab of metal hurtling through the night at a speed designed for one thing: to kill. It all happened in 3 seconds, just 3 seconds. But for Brooke, time slowed down and stretched out, each moment burning into her memory like a film strip from a nightmare. In the first second, the truck without headlights smashed directly into the lead Escalade with sickening force. The sound of crunching metal sounded like a monster tearing its victim apart. The front of the truck hit the side of the sport utility vehicle and sent it spinning 90 degrees. Sparks shot through the rain like deadly fireworks. In the second, the next Escalade slammed on its brakes, but the wet road offered no grip. The heavy vehicle swerved sideways, tipped over, and then slid on its roof with a horrible screech of metal on pavement, leaving a 20-meter trail of sparks like a giant scar across the bridge. In the third second, the last Escalade, the one with the pregnant woman inside, had nowhere to go. The chain reaction sent it spinning wildly out of control like a child's toy. The side of the vehicle crashed through the steel guardrail with incredible force. The rail buckled, and the big vehicle plunged over the edge, disappearing into the dark, churning water of the canal below. Brooke stomped on her brakes with everything she had. Her Honda spun 90 degrees and slid for 30 meters across the slick asphalt. She felt every inch of the skid as if it were her own skin scraping against the road. The car finally stopped 50 meters from the accident, pointing directly at the broken guardrail. For a single heartbeat, there was silence. And then total chaos erupted. Doors were thrown open. Men began climbing out of the two remaining escalades, dark shapes moving with shocking quickness despite their injuries. They did not look like typical car crash victims. They wore black suits and expensive shirts, and several of them were holding pistols that glinted in the headlights. Brooke knew instantly. This was not a group of businessmen or politicians. This was the mob. A man's shout in Italian cut through the noise of the storm. Gianna! Gianna! One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man, lunged for the broken guardrail, moving with the desperate energy of a cornered animal. Blood streamed from a gash on his forehead, covering one side of his face, but he paid it no mind. His eyes were locked on the black water below. "My sister's down there!" he yelled in perfect English, his voice raw with agony. "Let me go! I have to get down there!" Two other men grabbed him, trying to hold him back from jumping in after the vehicle. "You can't, boss. The current is too strong. You'll be killed." "I don't care. That's Gianna. That's my sister." He struggled against their hold, nearly overpowering both of them with the terrifying strength of his grief. Brooke sat frozen inside her car, her hands still clamped so tightly on the steering wheel that her knuckles were white. Her heart was pounding, not just from the shock of the crash, but from the terrifying reality of what she was witnessing. This was the Mafia. These were men who would not think twice about killing someone. If she got involved, if they saw her, if they remembered her face, she would be running for the rest of her life. A voice of pure reason screamed in her head. "Go! Drive away right now! You are escaping your husband. You cannot let anyone know you are here. This is not your problem." But she could not look away from the man who was screaming into the storm. The raw pain in his voice connected with something she had buried deep inside herself. She recognized that kind of terror. She knew exactly what it felt like to be deathly afraid of losing someone you loved. She knew the crushing weight of being completely helpless. Just then, she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. The truck driver's door swung open, and the man inside jumped out. But he did not run to help anyone. He turned and sprinted in the opposite direction, vanishing into the darkness like a ghost who had planned his escape long ago. Brooke blinked. No driver runs away from a wreck like that. Not unless it was never an accident to begin with. Not unless this was a planned hit. The thought came and went in a flash, because another image had taken over her mind completely. The pregnant woman. The woman in the sport utility vehicle that had gone into the canal. She was down there, trapped in the cold, dark water, drowning with her unborn baby inside her. Brooke shut off the engine. Her hand moved to the door handle. The voice of reason shrieked at her one last time. "You are insane. You will die. Even a champion swimmer would be terrified of those waves. You are on the run." But then another voice answered, a quiet but firm voice from the deepest part of her soul. It whispered, "There is a mother and her child dying down there. If you drive away, you will carry that guilt for the rest of your life. You might keep living, but that shame will eat you alive from the inside out." Brooke pushed the car door open. The wind and rain hit her with the force of a physical blow, as if the storm itself was challenging her, demanding to know if she was absolutely sure about this. She was. She did not know what she could possibly do. She did not know if she would even survive. But she knew she could not just sit there and let another woman die when there was even the smallest chance to save her. For the last 4 years, she had been Preston's helpless victim. Tonight, that was going to change. Brooke started running toward the broken guardrail, toward the sound of the desperate man's cries. In Miami on the third night, pulling into a rundown motel, just as the first warnings of the tropical storm began to flash across the TV screens. As the wind howled and the rain came down in sheets, Brooke felt a strange sense of calm. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one she had been living in for 5 years. But peace never lasts. Just before midnight, a sound like an explosion ripped through the storm. It was followed by the screech of tires and the horrifying crunch of metal against concrete. Brooke ran to the window. Outside, just down the road, she saw chaos. Flashing lights cut through the rain. Men were yelling in Italian, pointing toward the dark abyss that was swallowing a life. Or maybe two. Brooke raced toward the broken guardrail, pushing past the men. She glanced down, and her heart felt like it stopped beating. 50 feet below, the Black Canal churned violently in the storm. The water had no color, just the dense, inky blackness that absorbs all light. But then, about 100 feet from the shore, an eerie glow flickered under the surface. The Escalade's headlights were still on, shining up from the depths like the eyes of a monster being dragged to hell. The truck was sinking, slowly but surely. And that is when Brooke saw it, the sight that stole her breath. A hand, small and pale, was breaking the surface of the black water. It was not waving, it was begging. The pregnant woman was still alive, but she would not be for long. All around Brooke, the men were scrambling, trying to find a way down to the water, but the drop was almost straight down, slick with rain and covered in sharp rocks. One man had already tried to climb down and slipped, nearly smashing his head on a boulder before the others pulled him back to safety. Those expensive leather shoes and custom-made suits were not designed for climbing down a cliff or swimming in a storm. "Who in the world are you?" A hand grabbed Brooke's shoulder and spun her around. A very large man with a stern face and suspicious eyes glared at her. "What are you doing here? Are you one of them?" Brooke said nothing. There was no time to explain who she was. A woman on the run from a cruel husband, a person trying to vanish, someone who felt she had no place in this world. Instead, her gaze scanned the area with the sharp instinct of a former state-level college swimmer. The canal bank was steep, but a rocky ledge stuck out about 15 feet below. The water was deep, but she saw no dangerous currents. The distance from that ledge to the sinking vehicle was about 80 feet. It would be difficult, but not impossible. In Brooke's mind, a picture of Keith appeared like a flash of lightning. Her brother, lying on the bathroom floor, his lips blue from an overdose. She had performed CPR for 10 solid minutes until the paramedics came. Keith survived because she had not walked away. Keith was alive because she had refused to quit. Brooke ripped off her jacket and tossed it to the ground. Then she took off, her shoes, her bare feet pressing against the freezing pavement. The man who had been yelling Gianna's name turned, his frantic eyes fixing on Brooke. Blood was still trickling from a cut on his forehead, staining the side of his face red, but he seemed completely unaware of it. "What do you think you are doing?" His voice was cracking with desperation. Brooke looked directly into his eyes. She had no idea who he was. She did not know his profession, how many people he might have hurt, or why someone would want his sister gone. She only understood one thing. In those bloodshot eyes, she saw the pure agony of a man who was about to lose the most important person in his life. "I am going to save your sister." Then Brooke started running, not down the slippery slope the others had tried to use. She ran along the damaged guardrail to a point where the rock ledge was closest to the water, a 50-foot drop. She had competed in 30-foot dives before. This was another 20 feet, in a storm, into icy water, toward a sinking car and a pregnant woman who was about to drown. Logic screamed that this was a suicide mission, but Brooke was no longer listening to logic. She leaped, 50 feet of open air, falling through wind and rain. The world dissolved into a smear of darkness, water, and the howl of the wind in her ears, like nature itself, was screaming. Then she crashed into the water. The shock felt like 1,000 tiny needles piercing her skin at the same time. It was so cold, a cold that created numbness, a cold so harsh she almost opened her mouth to scream, which would have filled her lungs with canal water. Brooke plunged 10 feet deep before her survival instincts kicked in. Her legs kicked with power, her arms sliced through the water, and she propelled herself back to the surface. The waves crashed against her, pushing her toward the rocky bank and trying to pull her away from her goal. But Brooke had been a competitive swimmer. She knew how to interpret the current. She knew how to move across the water at an angle to keep the waves from sweeping her away. She swam toward the dimming glow, toward the vehicle that was sinking, inch by inch, into the darkness. Her lungs started to ache. Her muscles began to protest from the cold and the effort. But she did not stop. The light was getting closer. Then Brooke dove under the surface. Total darkness closed in around her like a black blanket. The freezing water put pressure on her ears. She swam toward the headlights, toward the faint shape of the SUV, which was tilting downward more and more. And then she saw her through the side window. A pair of eyes stared right at her. The eyes of the pregnant woman were wide with terror, but they were also filled with hope. She was awake. She was alive, and she was looking at Brooke as if Brooke were an angel that had dropped from the heavens to rescue her. The Escalade was going down faster than Brooke had realized. Underwater, the headlights began to flicker frantically, as if they were sending out a last distress signal before the battery failed completely. Brooke swam to the driver's side door, where Gianna was stuck. Through the glass, she could see the young woman trying to push the door open with both hands. But the water pressure on the outside was too strong. The door refused to move an inch. The water inside had already reached Gianna's chest, and it was rising higher with each moment that passed. Brooke put her hand on the window and motioned for Gianna to look at her. She tried to communicate with only her eyes. "Stay calm. I am going to get you out. Do not panic." Gianna nodded, but her eyes were still filled with fear. She held one hand over her swollen stomach, as if she were trying to protect her unborn baby from the death that was closing in on them. Brooke tried to open the door. It was completely stuck. The force of the water held it shut like a giant, invisible hand. She had to come up with a plan quickly. Every second that went by was another second that Gianna was losing. The back window. Brooke swam around to the rear of the SUV, her lungs now burning from the lack of air. She had been correct. The collision with the guardrail had completely shattered the back window, creating an opening just large enough for a person to get through. But surrounding the opening were sharp pieces of glass, like the teeth of a shark, sparkling in the faint light of the dying headlights. Brooke did not hesitate. She pulled herself through the broken opening. A piece of glass sliced into her left arm, creating a long cut from her elbow to her wrist. She knew she was bleeding. She could see the water around her turning into a light red fog, but she did not feel any pain. Adrenaline was pumping through her system like a powerful electric current, blocking out every feeling her body did not need to survive. Inside the SUV, the water was already up to Gianna's neck. She was crying, but her tears were lost in the murky water. One hand was still on her stomach while the other was desperately trying to release the seatbelt buckle. It was stuck. Brooke moved quickly toward her and tried to unfasten the belt. It would not budge. The mechanism was either broken from the crash or the water had shorted out the electrical system. She needed something. She needed something to cut with. Glass. Brooke turned to the busted-out window and ripped a big piece free, one she could get a good grip on. Its edge was as sharp as any knife. She moved back to Gianna and started sawing at the seatbelt with the shard. Just then, the car's headlights went out. Complete darkness fell like a heavy blanket, smothering everything. Brooke was blind now. She could only rely on touch, the rough strap in her hands, the grating back-and-forth motion of the glass, the feeling of the fibers slowly tearing apart. Finally, the belt snapped. Gianna was free. Brooke grabbed Gianna's wrist and started pulling her toward the empty space where the back window used to be. Gianna held on to Brooke with the kind of desperation you only see in a person who is about to drown, her fingernails digging so deep they hurt. But Brooke held on tighter. They were both scrambling through the opening when the SUV started to tip for good, beginning its final slide to the bottom of the canal. The powerful current spinning around the vehicle tried to suck them under with it. Brooke kicked with all her might, breaking them away from the pull. That is when the real fight for survival began. The surface was up there, so very far above them. Brooke had no clue how long she had been underwater. Was it 3 minutes? Or 4? Or even longer? Her lungs felt like they were filled with fire. Every single part of her body was screaming for a breath of air. And she was pulling along a woman who was 6 months pregnant. Brooke kept kicking. She wrapped one arm across Gianna's chest from the back and used her other arm to pull them through the dark water. It was a life-saving technique she had learned in a college course. But learning something in a classroom is one thing. Actually doing it in the freezing dark, with your lungs about to explode, was a whole different story. Up, she commanded herself. Up, up. Her legs pumped relentlessly. Her thighs ached, her calves started to seize up, but she refused to stop. She could not stop. A pale light appeared above them. It was faint, but it was light. The surface. Brooke pulled together every last bit of energy she had for one more powerful push. And then their heads broke through. The air was freezing and heavy with rain, but it was air. Brooke gasped, pulling it deep into her lungs, her chest heaving as if she had been brought back from death. Gianna came up right beside her. She coughed hard, spitting up salty water, but she was breathing. She was alive, but the danger was not over. The rough waves were pushing them violently, carrying them toward the sharp rocks on the edge of the bank. If the current smashed them into those rocks, it would be all over. Brooke changed their path, moving with the current at an angle instead of fighting it. She set her sights on a flatter-looking rock about 50 feet from them. 50 feet. Trying to swim that far with a pregnant woman in tow during a storm, her body completely worn out from being underwater, was taking its toll. Brooke's legs started to cramp up. It started in her left calf, which tightened with such pain it felt like someone was crushing it. Then, her right thigh locked up. She felt a scream building in her throat, but she clamped her mouth shut, afraid she would swallow more water. Her arms started to feel heavy and numb. She could no longer feel her own fingers. It felt like her body was shutting down, piece by piece. 20 more feet. Brooke had no idea where this new burst of strength was coming from. Maybe it was the picture of Keith on the bathroom floor that was burned into her memory. Maybe it was from surviving 4 years under Preston's thumb. Or maybe it was that flicker of hope she had seen in Gianna's eyes right before they surfaced. Brooke would not give in. 10 feet. A large wave slammed her against a boulder, but she managed to turn at the last second, taking the hit on her back to protect Gianna. The pain was sharp and immediate. Maybe she had a broken rib. She could not tell. She did not care. 5 feet. Brooke's hand hit the flat surface of the rock. She gripped it and pulled, dragging herself up. She pulled Gianna along with her, inch by painful inch, until they were both lying on the rock. Their lower bodies were still in the churning water, but at least their heads were out. Brooke was gasping for air, and her chest hurt so bad it felt like it had been split open. She turned her head to check on Gianna, and her blood ran cold. Gianna was completely still. Her eyes were closed. Her lips had a bluish tint. Her chest was not moving. She was not breathing. Brooke pushed all thought from her mind. She ran on pure training, on the skills she had learned over the years as a physical therapist. She positioned Gianna flat on the rock. She tilted Gianna's head back to make sure her airway was open. She put her hands, one on top of the other, on the center of Gianna's chest. Then she started the compressions, 30 chest compressions, 2 rescue breaths, and repeat. Brooke kept a silent count going in her head to maintain the pace. 1, 2, 3, 4. Her arms were already burning from the swim, but she pushed through the pain. 5, 6, 7. Gianna's chest went down under the force of Brooke's hands, then came back up. Nothing. 15, 16, 17. Gianna's lips were still blue. Her eyes remained shut. Her chest did not move on its own. A full minute went by. Still nothing. Brooke delivered 2 breaths into Gianna's mouth and immediately started compressions again. 2 minutes. The rain hit Brooke's face relentlessly, like a never-ending stream of slaps. She barely noticed. Her entire world was the count, the feeling of her hands rising and falling, and the desperate hope that this woman would just open her eyes. 3 minutes. No change. A quiet voice in the back of her mind began to whisper, "She is gone. You were too late. Just give up." But Brooke knew that voice all too well. 5 years ago, when Keith was lying lifeless on the bathroom floor, she had ignored it then. She was going to ignore it now. 4 minutes. A yell from up above cut through the roaring wind. Someone was making their way down the slippery canal wall. "Is she alive? Is she breathing?" Brooke did not look away. She did not reply. She did not have the breath for words. There was no time for talking. She just kept pushing. 28, 29, 30, breathe, breathe. And again. 5 minutes. Brooke's hands started to tremble, not from the cold, but from being completely drained of energy. Her muscles had been pushed past their breaking point a long time ago. Now, they were powered only by sheer willpower. But even willpower eventually runs out. 6 minutes. A figure landed beside her. She saw a pair of expensive leather shoes now covered in thick mud. The man's black suit pants were soaked. Then his face came into view. It was the man from the bridge. He had found a way down. The blood on his forehead was mixed with rain, creating faint pink lines down his cheek. His eyes were red, not from tears, but from total despair. "Let me," he said, his voice quiet and broken. "You are exhausted. Let me do it." Brooke shook her head, never missing a beat with the compressions. "I know what I'm doing," she said, her words coming out in ragged gasps. "Do not touch her." The man said nothing more. He moved back, but he stayed close. He just knelt there, watching his sister's still form, watching a stranger try to wrestle her back from death. 7 minutes. Brooke pushed down for what felt like the last time, using every last bit of energy she had. Her whole body felt like it was about to shut down. Her head was light from the lack of air. Her hands were totally numb. And then, Gianna coughed. It was a small, weak cough, but it was a start. Water came pouring out of her mouth and nose. She turned onto her side, choking and sputtering, throwing up a mix of river water and rain. She was breathing. She was alive. Gianna's eyes slowly opened, looking foggy and lost. Her lips started to move, as if she was trying to say something. Brooke had to lean in very close to make out the words. "My baby." Gianna's voice was barely a whisper. "Is my baby alive?" Brooke put her hand on Gianna's stomach. She was not a doctor. She did not have any medical equipment, but she could feel a soft little flutter against her palm. The baby was still kicking. "Alive!" "You are both alive," Brooke said, not sure if the water on her own face was from the storm or from her own tears. The man rushed forward and wrapped his sister in his arms, holding her so tightly as if he was afraid she would fade away if he let go. He did not say anything. He just held her, his whole body shaking with relief. Brooke slumped down on the rock, too tired to even kneel anymore. She was trembling all over, from the cold, from being so tired, and from the crash that happens when the adrenaline finally wears off. Then the man raised his head and looked right at her. It was the first time they had truly seen each other. The wildness of the accident was over. The desperate struggle of the rescue was done. It was just two people, soaked and worn out, looking into each other's eyes in the faint light of the stormy evening. His eyes were as dark as a bottomless pit, but looking into them, Brooke saw something she did not expect. Gratitude. This was not the casual thank you that people say out of habit. This was the deep, genuine gratitude of a man who had just been given back the most important thing in his world. He got to his feet and offered her his hand. "You need a doctor." His voice was quiet and sure. "Your arm is bleeding. Come with me." Brooke stared at the hand he was holding out to her. It was the hand of a gangster, a man from the criminal world. If she took that hand, she would be walking into a life that was nothing like she had ever known. But what else could she do? She could not return to Chicago. She had no other place to go, and she had just saved the life of this man's sister. Brooke took his hand. Things happened in a flash, too fast for Brooke to even process. An ambulance showed up in the darkness, almost like it had appeared out of thin air. It was not a typical ambulance from the city hospital with bright, flashing lights. This was a smooth black van with no logos on it. The back doors swung open, and two people in medical gear hurried out with a stretcher and a bag of supplies. They worked like a well-trained unit, lifting Gianna onto the stretcher, while an older man with short gray hair started to check her vitals. A personal physician. This family had a personal physician. Brooke stood there as they helped Gianna into the van, feeling completely out of place among the group of men in black suits who moved like a perfectly coordinated team. She did not belong in this world. She had to go. Her Honda was still parked up on the bridge. If she could sneak away now while they were all busy with Gianna, maybe no one would see her leave. Brooke took one step back, then another, and then a third. As she turned to run, a hand grabbed her elbow from behind. "You are not going anywhere." The voice was quiet and as cold as steel. Brooke turned to see the man who was holding her. He appeared to be around 50 years old, with salt and pepper hair neatly combed back and a chiseled face with eyes as sharp as knives. Nothing about him seemed friendly or open to discussion. "You just saved the boss's sister," he said, his voice completely steady. "Did you honestly believe we would let you leave without finding out who you are?" "I am just a person passing by," Brooke said, trying to sound as calm as possible. "I have no connection to any of you. I just want to go back to my car and leave." He stared at her with a cold stare, like a scientist examining something under glass. "You are not leaving until we find out who you are and what you were doing there." He then nodded at two huge men standing close by. They stepped up to Brooke's side. While they did not touch her, they stood near enough to send a clear message. There was no escape. 30 minutes later, Brooke was on the deck of a magnificent yacht docked at a private island pier. The vessel was at least 50 meters long, with a sleek design and dark tinted windows. The inside was a showcase of polished oak, cream-colored Italian leather, and artwork that Brooke knew was worth more than her entire old apartment. A woman in her middle years guided her down to a bedroom on a lower deck. It was large, with a double bed made up with fresh white linens and an attached bathroom featuring a marble tub. A fresh set of clothes was neatly folded on the bed, and a tray with a hot meal sat on a small table. It was lavish, comfortable, but still a prison. Brooke saw that the bedroom door had no lock on the inside. When she looked out into the corridor, a large man stood guard with his arms crossed, staring forward. He was not there for her safety. He was there to keep her locked in. Brooke stayed awake all night. She leaned against the round porthole, gazing out at Biscayne Bay, where the water had become peaceful after the storm. The distant lights of Miami's skyline twinkled like a separate galaxy, one she could see but could never touch. She had escaped from Preston, from the penthouse, from 4 years of his control and cruelty. Now, she was on a Mafia yacht, guarded by men who were far more dangerous than her ex-husband. The sheer irony of her situation was almost enough to make her laugh. The following morning, the silver-haired doctor from the previous night came to her room. He said his name was Webb, just Webb, no last name given. He checked the gash on Brooke's arm, stitched it with 12 precise sutures, and then bandaged it with the skill of a surgeon who had performed the task 1,000 times. "Gianna and the baby are both doing well," he said while putting his medical tools away. "She is conscious and has been asking about the woman who rescued her." "You did a remarkable thing, young woman. Very few people could have done what you did last night." Brooke remained silent. She did not want accolades. She wanted to be free. Later that afternoon, her bedroom door swung open, and the man from the bridge entered the room. He was the one who had screamed Gianna's name in such a desperate voice. He was the one who had cradled his sister on that rock during the storm. But the man who stood before Brooke now was completely different from the broken person she had seen the night before. He was dressed in a perfectly fitted black suit with a white shirt, no tie, and his dark hair was styled neatly. The cut on his forehead was stitched and covered by a small bandage. He looked more like the chief executive of a massive corporation than a crime boss, but his eyes told a different story. They were cold, sharp, and threatening. "Who are you?" He offered no greeting and no thank you, just a question that felt like a gunshot. Brooke had been preparing for this exact moment. She had spent the whole night thinking about her answer. "My name is Sarah Miller," she replied, her voice steady and calm. "I was just driving to Miami when I saw the accident. I noticed someone needed my help, so I helped." That is the whole story. The man stared at her without a word for a few long moments. He then opened a leather briefcase he was holding, pulled out a folder, and threw it on the table in front of her. "You are lying." His voice was completely empty of any emotion. Brooke glanced down at the folder. The top page showed a picture of her, taken from her actual driver's license. Below it was her real name, Brooke Sinclair. On the following page was another photo of Preston in a business suit, standing outside the federal courthouse with the self-assured smile of a very powerful man. "Your real name is Brooke Sinclair," the man stated, his voice as cold as steel. "And you are married to Preston Hale, a federal prosecutor." Brooke looked at the open file on the table, feeling as if the floor had just vanished beneath her. They knew everything. They had found not just her real name, but also her old address, her previous job, and even a wedding picture of her and Preston from 5 years ago. In the photo, she was smiling, her face glowing with the optimism of a 23-year-old woman who thought she had married her prince. She no longer recognized that person. "Who sent you?" the man across from her demanded, his voice so flat it was as if he were asking about the weather. "No one," Brooke answered, trying to keep her voice from trembling. "I have already told you. I was just passing by." "You are Preston Hale's wife," he interrupted. "He is the federal prosecutor who is leading the charge against my family. He has spent the last 2 years trying to send me and everyone I care about to prison. And I am supposed to believe that you just happened to show up on the very night my sister was almost killed, purely by coincidence?" Brooke was stunned. Preston was prosecuting this very family. The news struck her like a physical blow. In 4 years of being married to Preston, she had never known anything about his cases. He refused to talk about his work at home, and she was never allowed to ask questions. "I had no idea," she said, and this time she was telling the absolute truth. "I did not know what Preston was working on. He did not tell me anything. He did not let me know anything. He did not let me do anything." "You expect me to believe," the man cut in, "that a federal prosecutor would not tell his wife about the most important case of his entire career?" "Yes," Brooke almost yelled, "because he did not consider me his wife. He considered me his property, something he could control, something he could show off when he wanted, and something he could break whenever he felt like it." The room fell silent. The older man with graying hair, Nico, who had been standing by the door, raised an eyebrow just slightly, but the man across from her showed no change in his expression. He continued to look at her as if she were a puzzle he needed to solve, not a person, sharing her deepest pain. At that moment, something inside Brooke shattered. She had suffered for 4 years, 4 years in total silence. Nobody ever believed her. Nobody ever helped her. And now, after she had risked her own life to save this man's sister, he still refused to believe her. "You want the truth?" Brooke's voice began to tremble, not with fear, but with pure rage. "Well, here it is. For 4 years, my husband made my life a living hell. He dictated everything I ate, every piece of clothing I wore, and every person I was allowed to see. He would hit me any time I did something that he did not approve of. He once locked me in a room for 2 days just because I tried to send some money to my brother. I ran away because if I stayed for one more day, I would be dead. Not because he would have killed me, but because I would have taken my own life just to get away from him. She jumped to her feet, and the chair screeched backward loudly. I have no idea who you are. I have no idea who your sister is. All I saw was a pregnant woman who was about to drown, and I jumped in because I could not just stand by and watch another woman die when there was a chance I could save her. If you want to kill me for doing that, then do it. At least dying that way would have more meaning than dying by Preston's hand. An intense silence filled the room. Brooke. She stood perfectly still, her chest heaving with effort. Her eyes were bloodshot, but bone dry. After 4 years of abuse, she had cried all the tears she had. The man standing opposite her remained silent. He walked over to the window, presenting her with his back. Nico, check her neck. The man with salt and pepper hair moved toward Brooke. His gaze was no longer just suspicious, it held something new. Would you mind lowering your scarf? Brooke did not know why, but she did as he asked. She pulled the collar down, revealing the skin of her throat and chest. As Nico looked, the disciplined expression on his face finally broke. There are old bruises, he reported to the man by the window. They are shaped like a man's hand, and a faint scar is visible near her collarbone. This was not a single incident. Then, Nico reached into his coat and set an object on the table. It was a small black USB drive. We discovered this with your belongings, Nico stated. Have you any idea what is on it? Brooke stared at the drive. It was the one she had stolen from Preston's locked desk drawer, the one she hoped could be her leverage if she ever needed it. I do not, she said with honesty. I just knew it was important to Preston. I took it, because I thought it could be my protection if I needed to defend myself. Nico glanced at the man by the window. It holds proof of the payoffs Preston Hale took from the Benedetto family. The man turned and paced slowly back to the table. Benedetto, our rivals, the very people who tried to have my sister killed last night. The wife of the federal prosecutor who is trying to destroy my family. You just rescued my sister from a hit arranged by my enemies, and you are carrying the evidence that could ruin everyone, both your husband and the Benedettos. He paused, his expression unreadable as he looked at Brooke. This is either the most elaborate scheme I have ever encountered or the most incredible coincidence in history. I do not know who Benedetto is, Brooke said. I do not know who you are. I do not know anything. You do not need to, he interrupted. You only need to know that from now on, you will remain here until I figure out how to best use this entire situation. You are not a prisoner, but you are not a guest either. You are a piece on a chessboard, Brooke Sinclair, and I have not yet figured out my next move. Brooke watched him leave the room, with Nico following right behind. The door shut with a quiet click. She collapsed into the chair, her thoughts a whirlwind. She had fled from Preston, escaping 4 years of his control and his violence. Now, she was caught in a war between two powerful dark forces. Holding a USB drive filled with secrets that could bring them all down, she was free from Preston's grip. She had become a pawn in a game where she did not understand the rules, and she had no way of knowing which player was the greater danger. A week drifted by on the yacht, and Brooke began to mark time by the little things. Breakfast was served at 7. Dr. Webb came at 10 to redress her wounds. Lunch was at noon, followed by long, seemingly infinite afternoons spent gazing at the bay from her porthole window. Dinner was at 7, followed by nights that felt even longer than the days, filled with terrors of Preston and the one question that echoed in her mind. Where was he? And how long until he discovered where she was? They treated her with a strange, unsettling kindness. The meals were delicious, her room was kept immaculate, and no one bothered her. Yet a guard remained posted outside her door 24 hours a day. She was still a captive, but now her prison was a beautiful, gilded cage. On the 8th day, the door to her bedroom opened, and Brooke hardly recognized the woman who entered. Gianna Caruso looked nothing at all like the woman Brooke had rescued from the depths of the canal. Her lips were no longer tinged with blue. and her skin had lost the awful paleness that comes from a lack of oxygen. She now had a healthy, olive complexion, with long black hair that was brushed perfectly, and dark eyes that observed Brooke with a mix of curiosity and deep gratitude. Her belly, 6 months along, was a perfect full curve under a loose cream-colored dress. "So, it was you who saved me," Gianna said, her voice warm and without the guarded tone her brother always used. "I have been wanting to meet you for days, but the doctor refused to let me get out of bed." Brooke was not sure what to say, so she just gave a small nod. "Are you all right? I mean, with the baby?" Gianna smiled, placing a hand over her stomach. "He is healthy, kicking up a storm every night, like he is training to be a boxer. The doctor told me if you had been just 2 minutes later, he would not be here. You saved two of us. You do realize that, right?" Gianna moved to the chair across from Brooke and sat, not waiting for an invitation. "My brother suspects you might be a spy," she said directly. "He sees a conspiracy in everything. It is how he has stayed alive in his world. But I do not believe it." "Why is that?" Brooke asked. "Because a spy does not jump into pitch-black water to rescue someone they do not know." Gianna tilted her head, studying her. "A spy would have just let me die and then come to my family pretending to offer condolences. That would have been the intelligent move. What you did, putting your own life on the line for a woman you had never met, that is something a crazy person would do, or it is something a person with a good heart would do. And my money is on the second one." They sat together in silence for a minute. Then Gianna's voice softened as she asked, "Tell me about Preston, about everything you went through." Brooke's first instinct was to say no. She was not accustomed to speaking about it. For 4 years she had bottled everything up inside her because she had no one she could tell, and because speaking the words aloud would not have made a difference. But something in Gianna's eyes compelled her to talk. Perhaps it was the sincerity. Perhaps it was that Gianna looked at her not with pity, but with genuine understanding. And so Brooke started to tell her story, about the sweetness of his promises at the very beginning, about how he gradually isolated her from her family and friends, about the bruises he left in places that clothes would always hide, about being locked in a room for 48 hours with no food, and about the night she knew that dying would be a mercy compared to staying. Gianna listened to every word without saying anything. When Brooke was finally done, Gianna reached out and took her hand. Her hand felt small, but it was warm. "My mother was in a similar situation," Gianna said softly. "She put up with my father for many, many years. In the end, she could not take it any longer, and she decided to leave us when I was 10. She paused, taking a slow, deep breath. "But you are not her. You made the choice to live. You escaped instead of surrendering. That is the one thing my mother could not bring herself to do. And for that, I have immense respect for you." Gianna stood up, still holding Brooke's hand. "I am going to have a talk with Jace. You are not our enemy. You are a benefactor to this family. And if Preston ever has the nerve to touch you again, he will have to deal with my entire family." The very next day, Brooke was transferred from the yacht to the main estate on Star Island. Her new room was 3 times the size, with huge windows that looked out over the bay and its own private balcony. The guard outside her door was gone. She was still not permitted to leave the island, but she did not feel like a captive anymore. Over the following weeks, Brooke found out that Gianna had hurt her leg in the accident. The injury was not serious, but it required physical therapy to heal completely. And when Gianna discovered that Brooke had previously worked as a physical therapist, she refused to take no for an answer. They spent 2 hours together every single day. Brooke led her through the necessary exercises, and Gianna did them while sharing stories of her life inside a Mafia family. She talked about a cold, distant brother who would nevertheless do anything to keep her safe. She talked about the baby growing inside her and about his father, who had been killed in a hit before he ever learned he was going to be a dad. Slowly but surely, Brooke stopped feeling like she was on the outside looking in. Word about the woman who had saved Gianna had spread throughout the family. One afternoon, Bruno, the family's underboss, a man built like a bear with a face mapped by scars, showed up at Brooke's door. "I heard you can help with back problems," he grumbled. "My spine has been giving me trouble for years. The doctors just give me pills. Do you have something that works better?" After that, Brooke started helping more of them. They were men with injuries she did not ask about and with pain whose sources she did not need to be told. She just helped them heal, and they started to see her in a new light. By her third month there, Brooke was given a phone. Gianna presented her with a brand new one, telling her she was allowed to make one call, and only one. Brooke called Keith. Her brother's voice was strong and confident, more so than she could ever remember. He had finished his rehab program. He had landed a new job at a facility in California helping other addicts, and he was sick with worry about her. "Preston is searching for you everywhere," Keith told her. "He is acting like a man possessed." "Where are you? Are you okay?" Brooke smiled, the first genuine smile she had felt in a very long time. "I am somewhere, very safe." For the first time in a long while, Jace Caruso stayed a shadow on the periphery of Brooke's new life. She hardly ever saw him. He was perpetually occupied with his work. No one ever gave details, but there were times when she was in the garden, assisting Gianna with her therapy, that she would get the feeling she was being watched. She would glance up and find him standing on the second-floor balcony, just observing her quietly before he would turn and disappear. One evening, Brooke was alone on the balcony just off her room, looking out at Biscayne Bay as it sparkled under the moonlight. She thought of Preston, of the penthouse in Chicago, of 4 years spent in hell. Then she thought about the past 3 months, about Gianna, and about the intimidating men who had, in some strange way, started to treat her as one of their own. And a strange thought occurred to her. She was not looking for a way to escape anymore. For the very first time in her life, she felt like she might actually belong somewhere, even it was a scene of perfect peace, but it was built on a lie. While Brooke stood on a balcony overlooking Biscayne Bay, finally feeling safe, 1,000 miles to the north, her husband was coming apart. Inside his Chicago penthouse, Preston Hale felt his control slipping. 3 months. Brooke had been gone for 3 whole months, and it was like she had vanished into thin air. Preston had thrown all of his resources into finding her. He scoured security footage from across the city. He tracked every possible credit card purchase and bank transfer. He even used his power as a federal prosecutor to alert police in neighboring states, claiming he was looking for a key witness. But there was nothing. It was the not knowing that haunted Preston's nights. But it was more than just his wife's defiance. It was what she had taken with her. The very first day he came home to an empty bed, he discovered the USB drive was gone. That drive contained proof of every bribe he'd taken in the last 5 years. It had names, dates, dollar amounts, and offshore account numbers. It was enough to obliterate his career and put him in prison for life. Brooke couldn't just stay missing. She had to be silenced forever. He no longer wanted to bring her home. He wanted to make sure she could never speak again. The break in the case came late one night from a private investigator Preston was paying in cash. "I found your wife. She is in Miami. But you are not going to like who she is with." Preston sat bolt upright in his chair. "Tell me." "She is with the Caruso family." The words hit Preston like a punch to the gut. Caruso? Jace Caruso? That was the very same Mafia boss he had spent the last 2 years trying to build a case against. He was Preston's #1 target in organized crime. And now his wife was living inside the man's fortress. How? Preston clenched his jaw. Why? It seems she saved Caruso's sister after a car crash. Now she is living in his mansion on Star Island, and they are protecting her like one of their own. The investigator kept talking, but Preston wasn't listening anymore. His mind was already racing, forming a new and terrible plan. He could not get to Brooke while she was under Caruso's protection. He needed an insider, someone who could get into Caruso's world without setting off alarms. He needed Caruso's greatest enemy. A week later, Preston was sitting in a fancy Italian restaurant in Manhattan, facing Victor Benedetto, a 60-year-old man with snow-white hair and the cold eyes of a killer. Benedetto was the head of his own crime family and Caruso's bitter rival in a turf war that had been raging for decades. "What is this about, counselor?" Benedetto asked, his voice a low rumble. "You are the one prosecuting my family, yet you are the one who asks for a secret meeting. That is very interesting." Preston slid a photograph of Brooke across the table. "My wife is with Caruso. I need her back." Benedetto glanced at the picture, then looked up at Preston, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "I have heard the stories. The woman who pulled Jace's sister out of the canal. The whole city is talking about it." He let out a dry, humorless laugh. "If my men go near her, Caruso will bring all-out war. I am not looking for that kind of trouble right now." "I do not need you to touch her," Preston said carefully. "I just need you to create a diversion so that I can." Benedetto tilted his head, listening. "You stage an attack on the Caruso estate. While his men are busy fighting yours, I will go in through a back way and retrieve my wife. Caruso will never know you were part of my plan. He will just think it was another one of your failed attacks." "And what is in it for me?" Benedetto asked. A slow smile spread across Preston's face. "I am the lead prosecutor on your case. I can make the entire file vanish." A long silence hung in the air between them. Benedetto raised his wine glass, took a slow sip, and his eyes never left Preston's. "She is your wife," he said finally. "You have a right to bring her home. I can understand that. You have a deal." 2 weeks later in Miami, Gianna knocked on Brooke's bedroom door, her smile lighting up her face. She was in her 8th month of pregnancy, and her belly was beautifully round. "This weekend is my nephew Marco's christening," Gianna said. "You have to be there. You are our family's lucky star. Everyone is dying to meet the woman who saved my life." Brooke hesitated for a moment. She was still uneasy in large crowds, especially when those crowds were filled with dangerous men, but she could not refuse Gianna. "I will be there," Brooke answered with a smile. That morning, the Miami sky was a perfect cloudless blue. For the first time since leaving Chicago, Brooke stood in front of her mirror wearing a dress. It was a simple but beautiful pale blue gown that Gianna had picked out for her. She looked at her reflection and barely recognized the woman staring back. The dark circles under her eyes were gone. The constant line of fear on her face had softened. She looked calm. She looked happy. She had no idea that Preston was already flying to Miami. She had no idea that Benedetto's men were in position, waiting for the signal to attack. She had no idea that the storm was about to break. The christening was held at an old Catholic church on the mainland, about a 20-minute drive from Star Island. Nearly the entire Caruso family attended. Jace was there in a dark, formal suit, and Bruno stood beside him, looking annoyed at having to dress up. Dozens of other men and women, whose faces Brooke had come to know over the last 3 months, filled the pews. Only Brooke and Gianna stayed behind at the mansion. Gianna was too far along in her pregnancy to be comfortable for long, and Brooke offered to stay with her. 4 bodyguards were posted around the property. Star Island was known as the most secure neighborhood in Miami, with its own security force and a single entry road. Nobody imagined anything could go wrong on such a peaceful Sunday. Brooke and Gianna were sitting in the living room on the first floor, where large glass doors opened up to the pool and the wide expanse of Biscayne Bay. Gianna was excitedly talking about her ideas for decorating the nursery, and Brooke listened with a genuine smile. She had grown to love these simple conversations, these normal moments that Preston had never allowed her to have. The clock on the wall showed it was 1 o'clock in the afternoon when a loud explosion rocked the front gate. Brooke jumped to her feet. Then came the sound of gunfire. It was not just 1 or 2 shots, but the terrifying sound of automatic weapons shattering the afternoon quiet. Brooke raced to the window, and her heart nearly stopped. A team of men dressed all in black was pouring through the ruined gate. They moved with military precision, firing their weapons at the 4 bodyguards who were desperately trying to defend the house. This was not a robbery. This was a full-scale assault. This was war. Gianna ran into the room right after the first shots, her face pale with terror. What is happening? Benedetto. Brooke did not know how she knew, but the certainty was absolute. This had to be the rival family Jace had told her about, the same people who had tried to kill Gianna 3 months ago. We have to leave. Now. Brooke grabbed Gianna's hand. Is there another way out of here? My brother's office, Gianna said, her voice shaking. There is a hidden tunnel that goes to the boat dock, in the back. The 2 women hurried down the long hall as the sound of shooting grew louder and closer. Brooke could hear men shouting in Italian, the shattering of glass, and the heavy thud of boots on the floor. They were inside the house. Jace's office was at the very end of the hallway. Gianna ran to a huge oak bookshelf, tugged on a specific book, and an entire section of the shelf swung inward, revealing a solid steel door. You go first, Brooke urged her. I will be right behind you. No, Gianna insisted, shaking her head. We stick together. You saved my life once. I am not leaving you behind. Brooke was about to argue, but there was no more time. Just as she took a step toward the tunnel, the office door flew open with a crash. She spun around, expecting to see the attackers in black uniforms, but the man who stood in the doorway was not one of them. He wore an expensive gray suit with a crisp white shirt. His sandy blonde hair was perfectly combed, and he held a pistol aimed directly at Brooke. It was Preston Hale. Hello, Brooke, Preston said, his voice dripping with poison. I have missed you. Brooke was frozen in place. For the last 3 months, she had slowly, painfully started to forget his face, his voice, and the terror he made her feel. But now, it all came rushing back in a suffocating wave. Preston stood in Jace Caruso's office like he owned the place. He took another step into the room, his gaze scanning everything before it landed on Gianna, who was trembling by the hidden door. So, this must be Caruso's sister, Preston said with a cruel smile. The one my wife risked everything to save. How touching. She has nothing to do with this, Brooke said, stepping in front of Gianna to shield her. Get out of here. She is pregnant. You cannot hurt her. Preston let out a cold, empty laugh. I do not care about her. I only care about you. 3 months, Brooke. I looked everywhere for you. And here you were the whole time, living like a princess in a house full of thugs. It looks like you do not need me anymore, do you? The gun in Preston's hand rose slightly, now aimed squarely at Brooke's heart. Behind her, Brooke sensed Gianna move, about to run, or maybe try to call for help. She did not know for sure, and she did not dare take her eyes off Preston. Do not even think about it, pregnant lady, Preston snapped, his voice like a whip. You take one more step, and I will shoot my wife right in front of your eyes. Gianna froze. But then, she did something completely unexpected. She let out a cry and charged forward, throwing the full weight of her 8 months pregnant stomach. Preston immediately reacted by shoving her backward. She landed on the hardwood floor with a terrible thud, her hands instantly going to her belly as her face contorted in agony. Gianna! Brooke shouted, dropping down to her knees to help her. Gianna was on the floor gasping for air, her hands clutching her large belly tightly. Preston moved forward, grabbed Brooke by her hair, and violently pulled her to her feet. A sharp, burning pain shot across her scalp. Brooke fought the urge to scream, biting it back. Enough, Preston growled. We are leaving this instant. Wait, Brooke said, keeping her voice as calm as possible, even as her heart hammered in her chest. I will come with you. I will not fight. Just leave her here. She is 8 months pregnant and she just took a hard fall. She needs medical attention. If you drag me out of here and she dies, Caruso will hunt you down to the ends of the earth. Preston paused. Brooke could see him calculating the risk. In that brief moment, she knelt beside Gianna one last time, pretending to check if she was okay. As her hand rested on Gianna's shoulder, she slid the USB drive into the pocket of Gianna's dress. It was the drive she had kept with her this whole time, her final hidden weapon. I trust you, Brooke whispered, so quietly that only Gianna could hear. Then she stood up, and then faced Preston again. Let us go. Preston seized Brooke's arm, pulling her roughly toward the exit. The sound of gunfire still echoed from deep within the mansion. It seemed more distant now, a sign that Benedetto's diversion was succeeding. Brooke allowed Preston to lead her away without a single glance back. She heard Gianna cry out her name, her voice filled with agony and desperation, but she refused to turn. She knew if she looked back, her resolve would crumble. And if Preston realized the USB was missing, he would return and kill Gianna without a moment's hesitation. Preston dragged Brooke through the garden behind the estate, past the towering palm trees and across the perfectly manicured grass. Ahead of them, the gunshots continued, a grim melody for their escape. Benedetto was executing his part perfectly, keeping all attention focused elsewhere. The private dock of the Caruso family appeared. A white speedboat was waiting, its engine humming, with a man already at the controls. This was Preston's plan all along. Use the chaos to get inside the mansion, grab Brooke, and vanish over the water before anyone could stop him. Get on the boat, Preston commanded, shoving Brooke toward the dock. What do you plan to do with me? Brooke asked, her voice steady despite the frantic pounding of her heart. A smile spread across Preston's face. It was a smile she had witnessed 100 times before, the one that always appeared just before he did something terrible. You are going home, back to our penthouse in Chicago. And this time, I will make certain you never have another opportunity to leave. You will stay there until I say you can go, Brooke. Forever. Preston's grip tightened on her arm. She felt that same oppressive strength, the force that had smothered her for 4 long years and made her feel as small as a frightened animal. It was the power that had once convinced her she would never be free. But she was not that woman any longer. For the last 3 months, she had been alive. Not just surviving, but truly living. She had plunged into dark, cold water to rescue a man she did not know. She had learned to hold her head high and look people in the eye without flinching. She had reconnected with the person she was before Preston, a capable woman who knew her own strength. And there was something else. 2 years ago, Preston had insisted she take self-defense classes. He claimed it was so she could protect herself when he was away. But in reality, it was just another method to monitor her time, to know her exact location 3 nights every week. But she had paid attention, and she had not forgotten the lessons. The very tool he used for control was about to become her salvation. Preston pushed her toward the stairs that led down to the dock. Move it. We are running out of time. Brooke took a couple of steps forward. Then she seemed to trip. At least, that is what Preston thought he saw. She fell to her knees, her hands bracing against the wooden planks to break her fall. With an annoyed sigh, Preston bent down to pull her back to her feet. In that instant, Brooke moved. She drove her elbow directly into Preston's face with all the strength she possessed. The sound of bone hitting bone was sickening. Preston stumbled back, his hand flying to his nose as blood gushed between his fingers. The gun he was holding fell and clattered on the dock. Brooke dove for it. Her fingers grazed the cold steel, but Preston reacted faster. His foot slammed into her back, pinning her to the wooden surface. Then his entire body came crashing down on top of her, heavy and punishing. You really think you can fight me? Preston growled, his face twisted in rage, blood from his nose smearing his skin. You think a few months with the Mafia made you some kind of fighter? His hand wrapped around Brooke's throat and squeezed. Brooke could not get any air. Her vision started to go blurry. Black dots danced in front of her eyes. She felt her life slipping away with each passing second. Is this really how it was going to end? After all she had been through, to die by Preston's hands on a stranger's dock? No. Brooke's hand scrambled blindly across the wooden planks. Her fingers found something hard. It was a small, decorative rock, but it was heavy enough. She gripped it, and with the last of her energy, she slammed it against the side of Preston's head. Once. His hold on her loosened. Twice. He rolled off of her. Brooke scrambled away, coughing and gasping for breath, pulling air into her starving lungs like someone brought back from the brink of death. Preston was dazed for a moment. Then he slowly pushed himself up, his eyes glowing with a murderous fury. He located the gun, snatched it, and pointed it directly at Brooke. "I already told you," he said, his voice as cold as death. "You can never beat me. Never." A gunshot exploded in the air, but it did not come from Preston's weapon. Preston's body convulsed, his eyes wide with disbelief. He glanced down at his left shoulder, where a dark red stain was blooming on the expensive fabric of his gray suit. Then he collapsed, and the gun fell from his grasp once more. Brooke slowly turned her head. At the other end of the dock, Jace Caruso was standing, a thin wisp of smoke rising from the barrel of his pistol. He was still in the black suit he wore to the christening, but his shirt was now partially unbuttoned, and a smear of blood was on his wrist. He had battled his way back to her. Jace strode forward, kicked Preston's weapon away, and then stood over the man moaning on the ground. He lifted his gun and aimed it right at Preston's forehead. "No!" Brooke yelled, her voice hoarse from the pressure that had almost taken her life. "Do not kill him!" Jace did not turn to look at her. His gaze remained locked on Preston. "He nearly killed you. He invaded my home. He put my sister in danger. Tell me one good reason why I should not end this right now." Brooke struggled to her feet and staggered toward Jace. "Because his death would not make me free." Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. He would die a victim in everyone's eyes. Nobody would ever find out he was a monster. "I need him to face a trial. I need the world to see him for what he is. I need people to know what he did to me. That is the only way I can ever truly be free of him." Jace remained silent. His finger was still on the trigger. Brooke saw the war playing out on his face. The Mafia boss in him wanted to eliminate the threat immediately, but something else gave him pause. Then, very slowly, Jace lowered his weapon. They heard footsteps approaching from behind. Brooke turned to see Gianna walking toward them, one hand protectively on her stomach, the other clutching a small black object. The USB drive. "I got it," Gianna said, her voice still shaky from the terror she had endured. "The evidence you gave me. It is more than enough to keep him in prison for the rest of his life." She passed the drive to Jace. He looked at the device, then to Brooke, and finally down at Preston, who was still groaning on the dock. "All right," Jace said finally. "We will handle this your way. Preston Hale will go on trial, and he will spend the rest of his miserable life in a cell." The attack from Benedetto was over almost as soon as it had started. Once Jace and his men got back from the church, the invaders knew they had stumbled into a trap. They had lost the element of surprise and were completely outnumbered. Their only option was to retreat. The Caruso family lost 2 men during the fight, 2 men whose wounds Brooke had stitched up herself while they talked about their families. As she watched their bodies being carried away, she understood that a part of this new world she had found was now gone forever. Preston Hale was bound and locked away in the mansion's wine cellar. The cellar, filled with priceless vintages and kept at a perfect temperature, was now a temporary jail for the federal prosecutor who had once struck fear into the heart of Chicago. Jace went down to see him alone. He just stood there, watching Preston sitting on the cold concrete floor. His shoulder was bandaged from the gunshot, and his eyes were filled with a mixture of pure hatred and undeniable fear. "You actually believed you could come into my home?" Jace asked, his voice as casual as if they were talking about the weather. "You thought you could touch my sister, take someone who belongs to me, and I would do nothing?" "I am a federal prosecutor," Preston snarled, his teeth clenched. "If you kill me, the FBI will chase you to the ends of the earth." Jace cocked his head slightly, as if he were considering a business deal. Whoever said I was going to kill you? There are fates far worse than death, Preston Hale, and you are about to discover one of them. Later that night, an unmarked black sedan pulled up to the mansion's gate. The woman who got out was a petite Asian woman in her 40s, wearing a simple gray suit and sensible heels. But her eyes were as sharp as daggers, and her confident posture made it obvious she was not just some office worker. Special Agent Monica Chen, FBI. She was the one person in the entire system Preston could never corrupt, because there was nothing in the world she hated more than men who hurt their wives. She stared at Preston in the wine cellar with a cold look of satisfaction. "Preston Hale," she stated. "I have had my eye on you for a very long time. Your cases were always too perfect. The people you put away were always rivals to certain powerful families, but I could never get any proof until today." She held up the USB drive and a file containing printed images from the mansion's security cameras. Preston bursting into the office. Preston throwing Gianna to the ground. Preston dragging Brooke out of the room. It was all there, clear as day. "This is enough to destroy your career and your life." 3 months later, the trial convened at the federal courthouse in Chicago. The media swarmed the building like vultures drawn to a fresh kill. A star prosecutor exposed. The man meant to uphold justice was revealed to be a criminal himself. The story was too juicy for any news outlet to pass up. Brooke took the witness stand. Wearing a simple blue dress that Gianna had picked out for her, she told them everything. 4 years of torment, the nights she was locked away, the bruises hidden where no one could see, the escape, and the kidnapping. Her voice was steady. Her eyes remained dry. She simply stated the facts, one after another, as if she were reading a report about a stranger's life. Keith came in from California to give his testimony as well. Her brother stood in the courtroom, looking healthy and clear-eyed, and described how Preston had used him as a pawn to manipulate his sister. He spoke about the threats Preston made to stop paying for his rehab if Brooke disobeyed, and how the brother and sister were both trapped in separate prisons built by the same man. The charges against Preston mounted, one after another. Taking bribes from organized crime, conspiring with the Mafia, domestic abuse, kidnapping, assault with bodily harm, and breaking and entering. Every single charge added another brick to the wall that would imprison Preston Hale for the rest of his days. Life in prison with no chance of parole. The judge announced the sentence with a voice so flat he could have been reading a lunch menu. Preston just stood there, his face as white as a sheet, his entire body shaking. He turned to look at Brooke one final time before the guards led him away. His eyes burned with pure hatred. But Brooke was not scared anymore. She just met his gaze with a calm emptiness. He no longer had any control over her. Brooke stayed in her seat as the courtroom slowly cleared out. She did not cry, she did not smile, she just breathed. For the very first time in years, she took a breath that was not filled with fear. Outside the courthouse, Jace Caruso was waiting next to a polished black car. He had not come inside for the trial. That was not his environment, but he was there for her. "Are you okay?" he asked as Brooke came outside. Brooke glanced up at the Chicago sky, at the city she had once thought would be the place she died. Now it was just another city, nothing special. "I am not sure what okay means anymore," she answered truthfully. "But I think I will find out. One step at a time." Jace nodded. He held the car door open for her and did not say anything else. Brooke looked at the car, then at Jace, and then back at the courthouse she was leaving behind. She could go wherever she wanted now. She was free. Truly and completely free for the first time in 5 years. And she got into the car. Not because she had to, not because she had no other option, but because it was her choice. 2 years later, during a spring day in Miami, the Star Island mansion was shining under the April sun, decorated with white flowers everywhere and silver ribbons that moved gently in the ocean breeze. The sound of classical music came from a small orchestra playing in the garden, mixing with the soft noise of waves against the seawall nearby. Today was the christening for Marcus, Gianna's son, the baby Brooke had rescued while he was still inside his mother at the bottom of the canal 2 years ago. Now Marcus was almost 2 years old, with dark eyes just like his mother's, and a smile with dimples that had charmed the whole family. Brooke stood on a second-floor balcony, watching as more guests arrived in the garden below. She was no longer the frightened woman who had fled across 3 states. She was also not the stranger they took in to repay a life debt. Now she was Brooke and Claire, the woman in charge of the legal real estate division for the Caruso family. Boutique hotels, upscale restaurants, and rental properties all along the Miami coast. Every contract, all the supervision, and the management of these properties were her responsibility. It was legitimate work, with a stable income, and a life she had never even dared to dream about. And she had her own place, a small penthouse apartment at the edge of the island with a view of Biscayne Bay. It was a gift from Jace for her birthday last year. He told her she needed a place of her own when he gave her the keys, a space that was just for her, not for the family or anyone else. This is your home, Brooke. Your very own home. A soft knock on the door pulled Brooke from her thoughts. Gianna came in, looking stunning in a cream-colored dress, holding Marcus, who was wiggling around in his bright white christening outfit. "Are you ready? They are all waiting for us." Brooke smiled, then walked with Gianna down the stairs and into the garden. A small altar was set up under the shade of a huge old banyan tree, where a priest in his formal robes was waiting. Familiar faces were gathered all around. Bruno, with his huge, bear-like build, still looked uncomfortable in a suit, but his eyes would soften with love every time he glanced at the baby. Nico was standing right behind him, his hair now completely white, yet his posture was as straight as ever. Dr. Webb sat in the front row with a kind smile on his old face, and Keith, Brooke's brother, stood close to the family, looking taller and much healthier than the last time she saw him at the trial. He had relocated to Miami 6 months ago and was now employed at a local recovery center, helping others overcome addiction, just as he once had. The christening ceremony was a warm and serious affair. After it concluded, Gianna walked to the front of the altar, still cradling Marcus. "I would like to say something," she announced, her voice clear in the still air. "This is my son, Marcus, but his full name is Marcus Brooks Caruso. We gave him his middle name to honor the woman who saved both of our lives 2 years ago." Brooke felt like the wind had been knocked out of her. She had no idea. She stared at Gianna, her eyes already starting to burn. Brooke Sinclair was not a part of our family when she leaped into that dark water that night. Gianna went on. She was a stranger, a woman escaping her past, with nothing and no one to turn to. She was in the process of saving her own life. She could have just kept on driving, and no one would have ever blamed her for it. But she chose not to. She jumped into that cold, dark water to rescue a pregnant woman she had never met. She put her own life on the line for a total stranger. That is not what a stranger does. That is what family does. Gianna looked directly at Brooke, with tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. "You gave my son a chance to be born. You gave me the chance to be a mother. And now, my son will have your name for the rest of his life to remind us of your incredible gift." Jace Caruso came forward and stood next to his sister. He held a small black velvet box. "We are not quick to trust people we do not know," Jace said, his voice deep and calm. "It is how we stay safe in this world. But you showed us that you are not an outsider. You proved it not with talk, but with your actions, with your sacrifice." He opened the box. Inside lay a shiny silver bracelet with a single word beautifully carved into it. Familigia. "You do not belong to just one of us," Jace said, looking directly into Brooke's eyes. "You belong to all of us. This is where you belong, Brooke Sinclair, if you will have us." Brooke took a step forward, her legs feeling a little unsteady. She offered her hand, and Jace secured the bracelet around her wrist. The metal felt cool on her skin, and fit like it was made for her. And that was because it was. The entire family started to clap. It was not a loud, wild celebration, but a quiet, respectful applause full of warmth. It was the sound of some of the most powerful people in Florida welcoming a new person into their circle. Gianna wrapped her arms around Brooke, with Marcus squished between them, giggling with joy. "Welcome home," she whispered. Brooke hugged her back, and finally, she let her own tears stream down her face. But these were not the same kind of tears she had cried in that penthouse in Chicago. These were tears of pure joy. When they let go, Brooke gazed at the bracelet. Familigia. Family. She thought about Preston. She thought about 4 years of misery, the locked door, and the constant fear she lived with every night. Then she looked at the people around her. Gianna was beaming, holding Marcus. Keith was nearby, giving his sister a little wink. Bruno was clumsily trying to wipe his eyes, insisting he was not crying. And Jace was leaning against the banyan tree a short distance away, watching her with a slight smile. For the very first time, Brooks and Claire knew what it felt like to belong. Not because she was trapped there, and not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she truly wanted to be there, with them, with this family. The sun set over Star Island with a kind of beauty that still took Brooke's breath away. She was standing on the mansion's balcony, gazing out at Biscayne Bay as it sparkled under the moon, like countless diamonds thrown across dark velvet. It was the same water. It was the same bay, too. It had been years since she plunged into that same water to save a total stranger. Now she was here again, a silver bracelet engraved with the word Familia resting on her wrist, as she looked at the very spot that nearly became a final resting place for both her and Gianna. She heard gentle footsteps behind her. Gianna moved to stand next to Brooke, with Marcus fast asleep in her arms, his head nestled against his mother's shoulder. "What is on your mind?" Brooke did not turn, her gaze stayed fixed on the bay. "I am thinking about what might have happened if I had not stopped my car that night. Then you would not be here." Brooke slightly shook her head. "No. If that happened, I would still be running, still living in fear, and still completely alone. I would be alive, certainly, but I would not truly be living. I would just be existing from one day to the next. Until Preston finally caught me, or until I became too weary to keep going." Gianna said nothing. She just stood there in supportive silence beside Brooke. Marcus stirred in his sleep, his lips moving as if he were having a sweet dream. Then, another set of footsteps arrived. Keith came out onto the balcony, holding a glass of water. "Jace asked me to see if you are ready to go home. He is waiting downstairs." Brooke smiled. "Please tell him I will be down in 1 minute." Keith began to leave, but then he hesitated. He looked at his sister with a kind of admiration Brooke had never witnessed in his eyes before. "You know something? I am so proud of you. You accomplished the one thing I always thought was impossible. You got away. You built a life. Not just surviving, but actually living. I used to believe that both of us were trapped forever, me with my addiction and you in that marriage. But seeing you now, I truly believe anyone can change their own destiny." Brooke stepped toward him and gave her brother a tight hug. No words were necessary. The embrace and the shared understanding said everything about the long, difficult roads they had both traveled to get to this moment. When Keith returned inside, Brooke turned back to Gianna. "You know what? I think I finally get it." "Understand what?" "Why I jumped in the water that night." Brooke gazed down at the bracelet on her wrist. "It was not because I was brave. I was not brave in the slightest. It was because at that point, I had nothing more to lose. I had already lost everything. My identity, my freedom, and all my faith in myself. Jumping into that dark water did not feel like I was risking my life. It felt like the only meaningful action I had left to take." Brooke raised her eyes back to Biscayne Bay. The moonlight shimmered in her eyes. "But everything is different now. Now I have everything to protect. I have you and Marcus and Keith and this family. If someone were to fall into that bay tonight, I would still jump in to save them. But this time, it would be a much harder decision, because I would have to fight with all my strength to return, because now I have reasons to come back. Gianna smiled and gave Brooke's hand a squeeze before she carried Marcus back into the house. Brooke stood there for a moment longer, taking in the salty air before she headed downstairs. The shiny black car was waiting for them at the front gate. Jace was beside it, casually leaning against the car with his hands in his pockets. When he saw Brooke approach, he stood up and opened the door for her. "Ready to go home?" he asked. Brooke glanced into the car, then looked back at the brightly lit mansion. The sound of laughter drifted out from inside. Keith was waving from the window. Gianna was gently rocking Marcus in the hallway. Bruno was in a playful argument with Nico about something that was surely insignificant. "Home," Brooke replied, and she stepped into the car. Brooke's story was not some kind of fairy tale. There was no handsome prince on a white horse who rode in to rescue her. There was no magic that turned a pumpkin into a beautiful carriage. There was only a woman who chose life when she could have chosen death, who chose to help someone instead of turning away, who chose to have trust instead of fear. She did not find her family where she was born. She did not find love where she once believed she would be safe. But she discovered both in the very place where she had almost lost her own life. And sometimes, that is precisely how a family is created. Not by blood, and not by marriage, but by choice. By the critical moments that change everything. By jumping into black water to rescue a stranger, and finding out that this stranger will become the most important person in your world. If you have not subscribed to our channel yet, please subscribe and activate notifications so you will not miss the moving stories we bring to you every day. We would genuinely love to know how you felt about Brooke's story. Which part was the most meaningful for you? Have you ever faced a decision that had the power to change your entire life? Please share your thoughts and feelings with us in the comments below. We read every single comment, and we truly hope to hear about the stories that you hold in your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a life full of joy, and days filled with peace. Remember, you never know which small act of kindness you perform might change someone else's life forever, including your own. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next video. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.